Good afternoon. My name is Michael Budde, and I am a senior research professor here in the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. We're gathering in Chicago, as you know, to think together on what to make of a pope from the Americas, plural. Robert Prevost, raised in the south suburbs of Chicago and educated here and elsewhere in the United States, as you know, is the same Robert Prevost who, as an Augustinian missionary for decades, lived with and among the people of Peru. One church leader rooted in very different expressions of America, north, central, and south, rich and poor, imperial and far from the centers of power. Those binaries, of course, may obscure as much as they reveal, both about the contemporary world and about the life and times of the person who becomes Pope Leo XIV. There's a lot to be learned in all of this, and I'm glad you're all here to participate in the learning with one another. But perhaps just as important is what's to unlearn, or perhaps to reframe much of what passes for conventional wisdom. One of the most important things, perhaps, is to revisit the notion of America itself. There are few matters more disputed than what it means to be an American. Not only what qualities attach to it, but who gets to be included in the category whose opinions matter and whose do not. The America of Bolivar is not the America of Thomas Jefferson, which is not the America of Emma Goldman, which is not the America of Donald Trump, which is not the America of Berta Cáceres, which is not the America of Bartolomeo de las Casas. We're fortunate at a conference populated largely by theologians and religious scholars from around the world to host a world-class historian who offers us new ways to think about America in all its contradictions, contentions, and connections. Greg Grandin is the Peter V. and C. Vann Woodward Professor of History at Yale University. Rather modestly, he doesn't consider himself a scholar of religion or theology or Catholicism, but his new book, America, A New History of the New World, offers persons interested in the Catholic movement new ways to think about America, North and South, Latin and Anglo, African and indigenous, bloodthirsty and merciful, a hemisphere that reshaped the entire world in the past and continues to do so in the present.
Not too modest to say it's on sale.
I'm getting to you. I'm getting to you. Boy, these guys from Brooklyn, you know, it's just... Professor Grandin breaks open the cliches and the ethnocentrism that has surrounded many of the conventional understandings of America, the degree to which such has been the object and instrument of power, even as it provides a way forward for persons seeking a way to inhabit the world in a more humane fashion. This book builds upon his previous work, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, which was awarded a Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. One of the things that Professor Grandin's work does so well is to introduce us to new people we need to know and to complicate what we think we know about more familiar figures, events, and processes. In so doing, he shows us how history does more than evacuate a dead past, but instead points toward roads not taken, crises both averted and enduring, and new ways to keep score. We aren't the only ones who appreciate the value of Professor Grandin's latest book, America. See, I can hold it up. It's been a finalist or longlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Kirkus Award, and the Kundl Prize. Most recently, the book received the prestigious Ralph Waldo Emerson Award from the Phi Beta Kappa Society. In its announcement, Phi Beta Kappa declared that, quote, "This monumental work of scholarship shows that centuries of bloodshed and diplomacy not only helped shape the political identities of the Western Hemisphere, but also the laws, institutions, and ideals that govern the modern world." I would be remiss not to note that this book has just been released in paperback edition, and I would be remiss to not mention that our university bookstore has graciously has copies of that book and 8 others of his on sale out in the hallway, and because we've now been able to push his flight back, he might even stay and sign a few copies for you. One of the things that makes the Center for World Catholicism a worthwhile place to be is that we're not constrained in the questions we explore, the disciplines we invite into the conversation, or in whom we invite to think and reflect alongside us. We continue to be blessed by people inside and outside the Catholic world, people engaged at all levels of social struggles and inquiry, and who bring insights and arguments to the fore that we might not have without them. We're honored to have Professor Grandin among us today. It's a gift to be able to host him, and I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Grandin.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's really an honor to be here. And he put up with quite a number of emails. I mean, it was appropriate that in the last panel, I think that a number of panelists started with a confession. This is a Catholic, so I was gonna confess or give an act of contrition that I felt a little insecure. I'm not a historian of Catholicism. I'm not a theologian. I'm mostly a social historian. I did a lot of work in Guatemala and Central America, other places in Latin America, and on groups and movements that were deeply involved with liberation theology. But I wasn't really sure if I was worthy or nervous of being here. So I would email Michael and said, "You think the audience will know this? Do you think the audience would know that?" Or I was afraid of that I'd be just repeating things that people knew already, and of course I'm anxious that I might get some things wrong. So I'll ask for forgiveness in advance. And I also, of course, want to thank everybody who's organized the panel, including Marlon, who did a lot of great logistical work for me with the airline. I'm going to thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I did. But Marlon asked me if I did have a PowerPoint. But I said, why don't we just put this image up on and have it in the background. This is a classic. This is from Chulucanas. This is where Robert Prevost first landed in Peru in 1985. It's in the north part of Peru, border of Ecuador. It was an Augustinian missionary. It was almost a kind of a post-Vatican II a laboratory for a lot of the pastoral work that the Augustinians did before Prevost arrived there. And one of the things that some of the pastoral work did was to revive a kind of a pottery and artisan tradition. And this is dated from about, from what I understand, it's a little unclear lineage. I couldn't figure it out, but it's become a common image replicated in clay and paintings. But it's a classic liberation theology icon. Christ, if you're going to wonder. If I'm going to wonder, okay. I'm going to do a kind of nightclub kind of thing. Christ Campesino, it's typical liberation theology icon of Christ being crucified on a broad hoe and a machete. It's one of, you can see, obviously it kind of signals, it echoes many such symbols that one sees in the popular church in Latin America. Christ in the world, Christ in history, Christ worker. And it's become a kind of symbol of Chulucanas, the district. It's not a parish. It's quite sprawling area, which since the 1930s had quite a bit of labor, migrant worker militancy. It was an area dominated by sugar and cotton and rice plantations, and the first kind of layer of pastoral work that the Augustinians did in the 1960s were then built on by liberation theologians. Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru visited the area, and Prevost was, from what I understand, and again, this is all just stuff that I've
done as I prepared for this talk, was only there for about a year before he moved on to Trujillo, which is a town on the Pacific coast. Now, his time in Peru, he spends he goes back to Rome to finish his doctorate at one point, but there's two main significant periods or terms in which he's in Peru. One is from 1985 to 1998, more or less, if I'm getting these years right. And the other one is after he's made bishop, and that's from 2013 to 2023. And Peru, of course, is, along with Mexico, the two great vice royalties of the Spanish Empire. And what's interesting about Peru is if Mexico was maybe one of the most insurgent areas under the Spanish Empire, Peru was one of the most conservative. It was a redoubt of Spanish royalism. It kept slavery alive for much longer than in many other countries in Latin America, except for possibly Brazil. Bolivar and San Martin had to break down the gates a number of times and force Peru into independence. And so Peru, it was quite an amazing place when one thinks about it, a rich place, so deep in history for Prevost to have landed. The second place that that in his first term after Chulucanas was Trujillo. I keep on wanting to walk around, but then I have to keep on coming back here. Trujillo is on the Pacific coast, and that's a famous town. That's where Bolivar mustered the last army. He called out and he issued a promise of emancipation for any slave that left the sugar plantation. Peasants came down from the mountains. He built the last insurgent rebel army, and they climbed the Andes, and it was one of the final battles that finally ended Spanish rule in South America. So it was quite an historic place. When Prevost was there, it's much more integrated into the economy. Chulucanas is kind of far away, kind of remote. Trujillo is not exactly Chicago, but it's more closer to Lima. It's more integrated. The labor strife and around the sugar plantations was more acute. He was there during this remarkably tumultuous time, the rise of the Alan Garcia government, the complete economic collapse, the rise of Fujimori, the rise of the Shining Path, the regions that he were in weren't central to the war between the Shining Path and the military, but he wasn't completely outside of it either. He felt he was involved in a lot of that conflict. He also witnessed firsthand Fujimori's not just the rise of authoritarian government, but also Fujimori's austerity program, Fuji shock, where people know about, of course, Chile in 1973 and the shock therapy, but arguably the Fuji shock was much more punishing on the poor. It started off. It was much more draconian, and it was directed at a much more vulnerable population. Peru was really, as I said, it was conservative during the colonial period, and it remained actually a report just came out saying it's one of the most unequal countries in the world today, but a landed class, an extractive class, dominated the region. One of the things that's interesting about Peru, of course, even as describing it in these quite dire terms of hierarchy, feudal, neo-feudal latifundio, plantations that dominate politics, and an oligarchy removed from indigenous campesinos or mestizo campesinos, is that it was the cradle, in many ways, of liberation theology. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Liberation theologies had many kind of seedbeds. It's hard to pin it down exactly where it started. Peru, because of the pastoral work, the apolitical pastoral work of the 1950s and 1960s, and then the politicized pastoral work of the 60s, because of Gustavo Gutierrez, who was Peruvian and became one of the most respected intellectuals in the world. I mean, by the late 60s, he was traveling in Europe. He was giving talks at every divinity school. He was teaching. He was giving lectures. His books and his writings were in the library at Harvard Divinity School, at Hyde Park Divinity School. Peru became a very active and powerful seedbed of liberation theology, including in Chulucanas, and then in Trujillo. So I'm going to come back to Prevost's relationship with that a little bit later, but I'll talk a little bit more about liberation theology. And I don't think that I need to rehearse for this audience the powerful ethical imperative that liberation theology represented. The gospel of the poor, the idea that Christ entered history to deliver the poor from earthly woes, the powerful fusion of Catholicism's egalitarian thrust with Marxist analysis was formidable. Reading the book of Exodus as a guide for how to escape modern bondage while teaching the illiterate how to read, that they were agents of history, was a powerful force. It was a threat that was felt in Rome and Washington alike. The Vatican, at the beginning of the Cold War, had coordinated with the CIA against Moscow. But by 1962, the agency was warning JFK that the papacy could, quote, no longer be counted on to backstop communism because of the leftward drift of the church in Latin America. In many countries, Christian democratic parties, which was Washington's preferred vehicle for moderate reform, was splitting. Their militant wings were breaking with their CIA handlers. Richard Nixon complained to Henry Kissinger in a March 1971 phone call. He said, Henry, in the old days, you could count on the Catholic Church for many things. Not anymore. Now, the radicalization of Catholicism amused Fidel Castro. He was ever annoyed at the Soviet Union for turning wet socialism into rigid orthodoxy. Castro asked an interviewer, how was it possible that the Soviet Politburo was becoming ever more ecclesiastic, just as the sectors of the Latin American clergy were becoming revolutionary? Now, the United States found none of this funny. A growing despair, CIA analyst wrote of the situation in Guatemala, is indicated by the defection of priests and nuns to the left who now believe that no solution exists to the miserable poverty of most Guatemalans, except violent destruction of the prevailing order. So the Catholic Church was bursting open. It could no longer reconcile its humanist and its inquisitional wings, nor contain the ancient indignities of Bartolomé de las Casas, which had been pent up for centuries within its cloisters. The prophetic promise of deliverance can no longer be deferred, no longer remediated by charity and decency. Father Gustavo Gutierrez, it's hard to pin down exactly how well Robert Prevost knew Gutierrez, but it's clear that they had met and he respected him. He described all of this as an eruption of the poor into history. Now, there's many ways to tell liberation theology's story. The most common is to focus on Vatican II, changes within the church, the radicalization missionaries like the Marinos in Guatemala and in Peru also, and the many conferences in Medellin and Puebla. The church commits to a preferential option for poor, the idea of going out into the world and becoming a presence, creating networks of lay Catholic to participate in the activities of the faith, and building clinics and hospitals, cooperatives and radio stations. But, in reality, there were many different vectors. It's kind of hard to pin down. The history goes back further. You could trace it back in some ways, at least to the history of the fascist and anti-fascist struggles of the 1930s, when a good part of the church opted in the face of various threats, the threats of modernity, of secularism, of liberalism, of trade unionism, to ideologize itself, to turn away from rerum novarum and to embrace a kind of, what was in many places was just straight out fascism, phalangism, integralism, outright Nazism in Latin America. Many priests condoned violence against trade unionists, against leftists, against socialists, against liberals. Colombia, that was the case. In Guatemala, priests participated in when the 1932 uprising of peasants in El Salvador. Priests were very active in taking their confessions and then turning them over to the military and then executing them on church walls and leaving the blood up on the whitewashed walls of the church as a warning. Between 10 and 30,000 people were killed within a week period during what was called La Matanza, in which the church was actively involved. But more humanist Catholics, so before the term liberation theology they were called New Catholics, who wanted to respond to the challenges of modern life in a more human way, began to think deeply about the social order. And I think a way to kind of get out of the Medellin and Puebla and 1960s Vatican II way of thinking about liberation theology is the history of Camilo Torres in Colombia. He was already in the Dominican seminary when he witnessed the 1948 execution of a left liberal, Jorge Gaitan, in Bogota, that led to a decade of violence. Gaitan represented a kind of FDR-style reform, and many people thought he was a president in waiting. He became very much influenced by two anti-fascist French Dominicans that were involved in the French resistance, but they were also involved in an organization, an association, a society called Economy and Society, and they did work in France that foreshadowed a lot of heterodox economics, dependency theory. They were trying to understand and help poor fishermen who couldn't compete with larger fleets. And they came up with ideas that were very similar to what was going on in Latin America about underdevelopment and hence the term economy and society. And they wanted to revitalize Catholicism, and they wound up in Colombia, and Camilo Torres was very much influenced by them in the 1940s and 1950s mostly. He was from a wealthy liberal family, Torres. His decision to become a priest unnerved his liberal parents, his liberal secular parents. And he spent most of the 50s outside of the country. He traveled to Belgium. He studied at the Université Catholique de Louvain, where he was influenced by a cohort of young Belgian Catholic Marxist professors and fellow students. And he came to believe that the church's capacity to change, to become the only worldwide institution that can make real what he said, quote, a life centered totally on the love of others. he returns to Columbia in 1949, and he pioneers a kind of critical sociology. And some, I don't like doing, he was a Latin American this, but he was kind of like a Latin American C. Wright Mills, or maybe C. Wright Mills was like a U.S. Camilo Torres. But they, he built research teams. They went out to try to think about the sources of poverty. They created these centers of training, of literacy. They did longitudinal studies of political violence in the countryside. All at the same time he was doing the sociology. He began to get involved in political work. His goal was to merge all of the dissident parts of Colombian society, disaffected liberals, trade unionists, peasants, new Catholics, critical Protestants, socialists, the fledgling Christian Democratic Party, the historic Communist Party, the Cuban-inspired radicals. He hoped to gather all of those that he called the non-aligned, no alineados, citizens non-aligned with either the liberal or conservative party, the two-party system. He referred to their politics as anti-nada, against nothing, since nothing was all they have ever gotten. The phrase also meant that while the United Front was not communist, it was also not anti-communist either. So they were anti-nada, they were against nothing. They were anti-nada, but pro-everything that brought dignity to people's lives. Their platform was familiar: land reform, nationalization, decent housing, better wages, a more expansive welfare state. But Torres couldn't figure out how to transform what was this mass movement into a party that could break the stranglehold that the liberals and conservatives had on national politics. And the movement was repressed. He eventually gave up, and in 1966 he joined the Ejército Liberación Nacional, one of the first and early insurgent groups in Colombia that, unlike the FARC, the other more famous insurgent group, had a very strong Christian orientation, a proto-liberation theology orientation. There were a number of priests and nuns that had already joined it. He famously said right before he joined, "I say a little bit in jest, but also quite seriously, that the Catholic who is not a revolutionary, who is not with the revolution, is living in mortal sin." And Torres was killed in his very first encounter with the national military in 1966. So this was even all before liberation theology had a name. The name of liberation theology comes from Gustavo Gutierrez's series of lectures that he gives towards the theology of liberation, and that's in 1968, and his book is published in 1971, and that's when the kind of term takes off. Now, all of this is happening. People tend to discuss the 1960s and 70s in Latin America in silos. There's the literature boom, there's liberation theology, there's heterodox economy known as dependency theory to try to understand the underdevelopment of the world. There's pedagogy of the oppressed, the Paulo Freire's method for breaking out of the scholasticism of the school system and teaching people to think critically as they learned how to read and write. But actually, if you take you can't do it in silos. You have to think of this as all of a piece. In some ways, it's something akin to a second enlightenment in many ways. The vibrancy was so alive and so moving and mobilizing in one country after another. The psychology of liberation, the theater of the oppressed, the literature and the art, the politics of it all. The first enlightenment was about how to overthrow royal absolutism, royal absolutism. The second enlightenment was about how to end neocolonial dependency, and bring about the promise of modernity. And liberation theology was all bound up with it. the Salvadoran Jesuits furnished the clearest example of this kind of intellectual ambition. A group of Central American-based Jesuits made a collective decision to enter doctoral programs abroad in economics and anthropology and philosophy and social psychology to gain knowledge that they would then apply in their come back and apply in their country's emancipation from neocolonialism. Some of the names of these priests you might know: Father Ignacio Ellacuria, but also Father Ignacio Martin Barrow. He founded Liberation Psychology. It was dedicated to treating the social trauma of exploitation and to what he called de-ideologizing reality, puncturing the myths that cause people to internalize feelings of inferiority, especially those who live in relations of domination or extreme poverty. Most importantly, Catholicism and the region's heterodox economics fused. Gustavo Gutierrez said, he has this great sentence: dependency and liberation are correlative terms, because when you have dependency, the next step is to find liberation. It describes not just a theological formulation, but a sociological process. The ideas travel together through the same networks, the same communities. At the same time, a quiet feminism ran alongside all of this. Priests, nuns, professionals dropped their titles. Everyone was compañero and compañera. Women took on a greater role in pastoral work. It really was and we know the history. We know what happens, and it happens in different ways in different places. But the clampdown comes, and the coups come in Chile and Bolivia in '71, in Chile in '73, in Uruguay in '73, in Argentina in '76. Peru has a little bit of a different history here, though, and this is what's key, I think. Peru has a military coup in '68, but it's a left-wing military coup, allied with the Soviet Union. And by '79, they launch a massive land reform. I mean, a serious land reform, and in a lot of places that Prevost would wind up in later, in Trujillo, where the sugar plantations of Trujillo and the cotton plantations up in Chulucanas, and so from '68 to say '75, there's another reason why liberation theology was so embedded in Peru is that they were more or less had partners with the national government. The military government worked with priests during this period, but of course that didn't last. That for a lot of reasons. In '75, that experiment was over. And in many places, the land reform, while it did break the back of the landed class in the countryside to some degree, it turned plantations into worker cooperatives. A lack of credit, a lack of other material and political support, especially after 1975, led a lot of these national expropriated and then cooperatized plantations to fall apart in many ways. So in some ways, the old feudal order was broken, but what was left in its place was something not quite liberation. So by the time Prevost shows up in 1985, Peru has already gone through quite a tumultuous period of political upheaval, of economic upheaval, and it doesn't end. As I mentioned, he shows up. He's there in 1985. There's the economic crisis. There's a return to democracy. There's a massive economic crisis under Alan Garcia's government. And then the beginning that which paves the way for the rise of Alberto Fujimori, and then his the Fuji shock. But what's interesting about Prevost's time he also shows up in 1985 right at a time when the Vatican is about 2 or 3 years into its counteroffensive, its attempt to roll back liberation theology. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, head of the Congregation of the Faith, Pope John Paul II, a committed anti-communist who Nixon would be happy to know recommitted the church to Washington's fight against the Soviet Union. And as part of that, there was a sustained assault on liberation theology, both doctrinally and institutionally in Latin America. And one of the places that they would naturally focus on because of the strength of liberation theology and because of the prominence of Gustavo Gutierrez, if they could silence him, then they could silence anybody, was Peru. To use an inflammatory word, the Inquisition against Gutierrez started in 1983, 2 years before Prevost got there. And Ratzinger didn't have enough support in Peru. The country's Congress of Bishops in the mid-1980s was split maybe 3 ways. With maybe a third were liberationists, maybe a third were apolitical centrists, and maybe a third were conservative. And even though Ratzinger gave instructions to read through Gutierrez's writings and see if they could find any hint of Marxist influence or heresy, basically he couldn't get consensus among Peruvian bishops to silence Gutierrez. But it went on and on and on. I mean, the official investigation into Gutierrez, I think, went on until 2004, and he was constantly being pressured to answer for himself, to rewrite essays, to explain passages, what he meant, to prove that his writings aligned with church doctrine. At the same time, during this period that Prevost was first there, 85 to 98, what you saw was a gradual ascension of traditionalists and conservatives to power. That tripartite balance within the Congress of Bishops that I mentioned didn't last long. Soon, Opus Dei had become one of the biggest strongholds of Opus Dei in anywhere in the world. Most of the bishops, the historian Carlos Picón Camare, he said that Peru was a bastion of Opus Dei bishops, probably the biggest, as I mentioned, the strongest stronghold in the world. At the same time, if Opus Dei represented a more respectable urban Catholic traditionalism, the vanguardist Sodalicio de Vida Cristiana, or Society of Christian Life, which was founded in 1971 by a school teacher lawyer, Luis Fernando Figara, directly challenged liberation theology. Figara was an admitted fascist. He also established the Peruvian branch of the Brazilian Society for the Defense of Traditional Family and Property. It was a far-right organization whose ideological roots could be traced back to the fascist politics of the 1930s. That grew in power. At one point, Pope John Paul had, in 1997, Pope John Paul granted the Sodalicio a significant degree of autonomy, elevating it from a diocesan organization accountable to a local bishop to a society that answers only to Rome. So over the course of these 13 years, Prevost witnessed firsthand this conservative ascension. And until recently, he's been circumspect about his public remarks about liberation theology. He signals that he at least partially agreed with Ratzinger that some liberationists had gone too far in sociologizing Catholicism. Quote, I was neither extreme in the sense that there were some missionaries in Peru perhaps too friendly with Marxist ideas, including using violence to fight for the rights of the poor. But Prevost's sympathies, though, were fairly clear. He was fully committed to a vision of a church dedicated to the poor. Along with his fellow Augustinian missionaries, Prevost had arrived in a region, Chulucanas, that was built on a liberationist model. They had met, they admired Gutierrez. Prevost's circumspection was probably partly temperamental, but also no doubt strategic, since the circumstances of Peru in those years demanded circumspection. Then in his second period in Peru, Pope Francis took a special interest in returning Prevost to Peru. He rushed his appointment as Bishop of Chiclayo by bypassing established normal procedures. The appointment itself was in many ways an opening shot in the new Pope's counteroffensive in restoration of liberation theology, since the office had been held by Bishops Taido Budde for over 46 years. As the Prevost, he used his down-the-middle, as his older brother said, style to disarm antagonists, even as he waited for the right moment to act. And that time came when a brewing scandal surrounding the Sodalicio de Vida Cristiana rocked Peru. And I won't go into the details here because I think Paula tomorrow is going to discuss them, and she was very much involved with them. But that, in many ways, was the beginning of the reestablishment of a progressive clergy within Peru. There was a rehabilitation of Gustavo Gutierrez, and by the end of Prevost's tenure, liberationists were holding a number of major offices, including the key Archbishop of Lima, which had long been an Opus Dei stronghold. So under Francis, and with Prevost as a crucial ally, the balance of power within the Peruvian church began to shift. Nearly all priests allied with Sodalicio, including as I said, the Archbishop of Lima, had given way to more moderate priests or progressive priests. And so it's kind of interesting to think about this kind of, his first period there was during a moment of rollback of liberation theology, and his second period there was a kind of rollback of the rollback. Now, Prevost first met Cardinal how do you say that Italian name? Bergoglio in Argentina in 2004. When the future Pope was serving as the Jesuit Archbishop of Buenos Aires. By this point, one might have assumed that the battle against liberation theology had been won. The church in Peru was nearly completely controlled by Opus Dei. I'm breaking chronology here. I've already explained that will no longer be the case soon enough, but this is 2004 now we're talking about. Throughout Latin America, by the late years of John Paul II's papacy, many of the movement's leading figures had been silenced, censured, or excommunicated. Others were killed. The assassination of El Salvador's Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1980 by a right-wing death squad trained by the United States is well known, but scores of other priests, nuns, and catechists throughout Central America had been murdered. Many more were driven into exile. In November 1989, the U.S. created Atlacat Battalion in El Salvador, assassinated those 6 Jesuits that I mentioned, the housekeeper and their teenage daughter, on the campus of San Salvador's Universidad Centroamericana. And Ratzinger's doctrinal arguments seemed to have won out. The Cardinal Inquisitor had no problem, of course, criticizing capitalism. Many popes had done so at least since 1891, and we all know what 1891 is. It was Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, which condemned the corrosiveness of free market and the miseration produced by the Industrial Revolution. But Ratzinger argued that liberation theologians had gone too far to assign Christ's crucifixion primarily a worldly meaning, or to find sin as a structural problem was to privilege the temporal over the transcendent. The concept of class struggle was a special heresy for Ratzinger, since it cleaved humanity into irreconcilable economic antagonisms. The community of Christ, like the body of Christ, was whole, and God didn't take sides in class war. Yet the idea that Christ promised deliverance not in the eternal afterlife, but here in the world, in historical time, was not an idea so easily quashed. Many priests, including Prevost and Bergoglio, had been indelibly stamped by the ethical imperative of liberationism. They might have thought that Camilo Torres had been reckless, but they didn't want to hand the church over to traditionalists and conservatives intent on rolling back the reforms of Vatican II. They still found something profound in the insistence that among the poor was the place God chose to be found. In Argentina, a kind of bottom-up rectification, independent of Ratzinger, of liberation theologian, had been taking place in the 1970s, one that placed less emphasis on structural analysis and more on pastoral encounters and popular piety. Rather than the phrase liberation theology, the Jesuit philosopher Juan Carlos Scanoni, these Italian names in Argentina always throw me, Scanoni, a Jesuit philosopher and theologian at the Colegio Máximo de San Miguel in Buenos Aires. He was one of Francis, I'm just going to say Francis, even though he's not Pope yet. One of Francis's teachers preferred the term theology of the people, where liberation theology tended to see the poor through a socioeconomic lens. The theology of the people treated the poor as bearers of Christian virtue. So theology of the people retained liberation theologies focused on the poor, but it stripped away the Marxist analytical framework that had given Ratzinger his opening. It could not be accused of class struggle. It couldn't be dismissed as sociology investments. Francis's relationship to liberation theology was complicated, to say the least, during the Argentine dictatorship, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. Raising questions that have never been fully resolved and questions that shadowed him into his papacy. But after Argentina returned to democracy in 1983, he found the idea of theology of the people a way to reclaim the liberationist spirit, but on his own terms. He could speak of the people, of popular piety. He could say that the basis of social justice was found among the marginalized and what he called the people's mysticism. I mean, I guess Marx is bad, but Heidegger is okay. I don't know, the people's mysticism, without invoking the Marxist analytical vocabulary that had given Rome its opening. The intense popular devotion represented, say, by the burning of strong copal incense at dawn in some lonely adobe church in Argentina's Andean Northwest, in Salta, for instance, where Quechua faith and Catholic ritual had fused into something neither Rome nor Marx could fully understand, was a living encounter with the divine. That's the people's mysticism. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Bergoglio was citing the theology of the people not as a tactical retreat from liberation theology, but its deepest expression. As Pope, he used the concept to imagine a church of radical inclusion for, as he put it, and somebody referenced earlier, for all, or everybody. Theology of the people became something of an organizing principle for Francis's papacy, the idea capacious enough to hold together a polarized congregation. Progressives appreciated his description of a church as a field hospital, tending to a broken world's casualties. And thanks to his rehabilitation of liberation theology, he had no problem naming who and what broke that world. In his first major document issued just months after his election, he dismissed trickle-down economics as expressing a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those who wielded economic power. He declared that the powerful feed off the powerless, and described the global poor not just as the wretched or the exploited, but as something worse, the discarded, the leftovers. And Robert Prevost also, before becoming Pope, had likewise contributed to this roundabout, bottom-up demarxification of liberation theology. In an interview he gave to his biographer, I think just maybe a year ago, he said, the way that people look back on what we label liberation theology, I think it oftentimes erroneous and incomplete. Because the gospel preaches liberation, the gospel calls us all to freedom. Liberation theology, from the perspective of Gustavo Gutierrez, for example, is beginning to look through the eyes of the poor, with the poor, to understand how God is in and among us. It's almost as if once you invoke the poor and the people, and not Marx, you could say the most radical things. And as Pope, he's wasted little time doing so. His first major papal document, and issued in October 2025, dismissed as pseudoscientific the claim that free markets would eventually lift people out of poverty. He warned against a church that cozied up to elites in exchange for privilege and security. He denounced the treatment of migrants, quote, as if they were garbage and not human beings. Leo has called the U.S., obviously we know that Leo has called the U.S. war in Iran as unjust, morally indispensable. He's condemned neo-colonialism in Africa. With sorrow, I think of Gaza, he said, denouncing Israel's bombing of children. In his Holy Thursday sermon, Leo preached that, quote, the imperialist occupation of the world is disrupted from within. I mean, this is like straight, forget liberation theology. This is like, Frantz Fanon. The violence that until now has been the law is unmasked. The poor, imprisoned, and rejected Messiah descends into the darkness of death, yet in so doing, he brings a new creation to light. Now, in the shadow of Trump's war on migrants, on the war in Iran, in the shadow of it all, it's clearly making a political point and using classic liberation theology to talk about Christ's crucifixion and resurrection as exposing the machinery of worldly conquest, terror, and cruelty wherever it is found, wherever it is exercised, as built on a lie. So it's no wonder that Steve Bannon has identified Leo as, quote, the anti-Trump Pope, unquote. Someone who's from the heartland of the nation. He seems to stand opposed to nearly every aspect of national power, especially as that power manifests itself in extreme form under Trump. Aggressive war, mass deportation, massive incarceration rates, an intense concentration of wealth, the rise of artificial intelligence, unfettered capitalism. Leo appears to be continuing Francis's effort to without changing doctrine itself, pull the church away from culture war preoccupations with sex and abortion toward a broader social justice agenda. Where Francis and Argentine focused on Latin America, Leo seems to be fighting for the soul, or at least the voting preferences of Catholics in the United States. Now, I'll just end by saying Sidney Hook, one of the greatest ironies of the last century is that the institution that the philosopher Sidney Hook once called, quote, the oldest and greatest totalitarian movement in history, the Catholic Church, supplied the oppressed with tools for critical thinking and advanced a rational universal humanism that is now everywhere under threat. Today, that irony is amplified. The Catholic Church, led by Leo, has become perhaps the only global mobile force capable of challenging a rogue United States. And it is in no small part, and it is able to do so in no small part because of Latin America. Thank you.
Altogether now, those of us in the Midwest have to tell a guy from Brooklyn how to pronounce Italian names. Bergoglio.
My
Boy,
mouth was dry.
you know the world has gotten strange when they forgot Italian names in Brooklyn. Good Lord. Yeah. Yeah, I know. We have time for a few questions and conversation. I'd like to make a couple of guidelines to do that, please. Please limit yourself to one question. Make sure it's a question. And in the interest of fairness, I would like to give preference to people who haven't had a chance to raise a question in the first session.
It occurs to me that I want to ask a question that you're going to say, well, I can't answer that question, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. What if Ratzinger was right theologically, and that both Bergoglio and present Pope Leo XIV took that to heart and tried to delve deeper into what you call popular mysticism or popular religion as pointed to by Marx's concern with the poor, but had just a much more pastoral approach, and that maybe this was a good thing. Ratzinger's intervention, granted, it's controlled by dark villains in Latin American politics, but at the same time, I wonder if Ratzinger was right by not canceling off the transcendent, and is it possible to tell this story in a way that we've arrived at a kind of synthesis, which I felt you were coming to toward the end? Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not I'm not a historian of the Vatican. I don't know. Right. I mean, I probably have a caricatured version of Ratzinger in my head, and I'm sure that it is more nuanced. I know it's more nuanced. I know, but they were pretty hard with Gustavo Gutierrez. I mean, it was pretty nonstop.
But whether he was right or not, I mean, I guess was he right in what, on what register, on what level was he right? I mean,
well, okay, so right toward the end of your talk, you start to characterize Prevost, the Pope, as showing that the poor reveal to everyone the poverty which turns us to God.
yeah.
I like that idea. And I think that even Gutierrez, in his book on Job, started to arrive at that too. And he himself had, a partly positive look back at the Inquisition, the Inquisition.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets into a lot of theological debates that are nuanced and where I'm looking for the cleavages and the power dynamics and the consequences of those fights, rather than spending time in the nuances. But I agree with you. I mean, Gustavo Gutierrez, yeah, he one of his implicit response to being investigated was to write a book about Bartolomé de las Casas, which I read as a kind of him saying, fine, you don't want Marx, I'll just go back to de las Casas and we'll be able to say the same thing. We'll be able to make the same critiques. And in some ways, what does Marx do for liberation theology? He's a totem. It's an intellectual. It was an intellectual movement at the moment that inspired people to think critically about power and everything. But if there are other ways of doing it, then fine. It wasn't Marx that led Torres to pick. It wasn't it wasn't Marx that led to the radicalization of liberation theology itself, in the sense of the Marinos in Guatemala joining the FAR, or Torres joining the ELN. That's not what leads to it. But I agree with you. I think Gutierrez was making a concession and saying, okay, fine, we don't need Marx. We don't, we can go back to the origins of the beginnings of the conquest and listen to De las Casas and find justification for the.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah,
So I think that's right.
I keep going, but there's Buddy's telling me to shut up. Yeah, there's a,
Someone hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
This one. There's somebody.
I'm curious about the North American part of this story. All I can think of that Provost was going to a seminary that was sending from CTU people down to South America, and like 4 blocks over, University of Chicago was also sending people to South America, and that that tension. So what can you say about how were North Americans at this time processing liberation theology, and do you know anything about how Provost and other folks what did they bring from North America, learning about South America to South America? Like, what's that process?
Yeah,
Like,
well, I your first point, I mean, for those, the uninitiated, what is a reference to the Chicago boys and the Chileans and that were brought up to the University of Chicago to be trained in an extreme version of neoclassical economics, which they then goes back and becomes the basis of neoliberalism and the shock therapy. So that was the reference to the Chicago. So CTU. So you on one hand you have the Department of Economics, and on the other hand you have CTU. CTU was I think very much influenced by liberation theology. Gutierrez spoke there. They had his book, and they taught his book in the curriculum. I think the influence spread far and wide. I kept the argument, in Latin America, but the liberationist ethos or creed spreads out through the decolonizing world, Africa, Asia, the Philippines. The Archbishop of Canterbury, you cited Gustavo Gutierrez in his critique of Margaret Thatcher's attack on the welfare state. So I think that these currents were all around, and there was a lot of interplay. Richard Schall, who was a Protestant missionary who worked in Bogota, and he worked with Camilo Torres, and then he went back to the United States and he worked with Martin Luther King. So that there was a lot of overlap. That's what I was trying to get at. That the story of liberation theology, rooting it in Vatican II, the Medellin Conference, the Puebla Conference. That's all true. But then you these unexpected connections. When Schall became on the faculty of the Divinity School at Princeton, he's Protestant, but he's training Catholic theologians from Latin America, liberation he's working closely with Catholic liberation theologians. So there's a lot of ecumenical kind of connections that are going on at the same time. So the network, the vectors, and the connections are multi-dynamic and hard to pin down, right? I mean, these French, the the French resistance Dominican priests that wind up in Colombia in the 1950s, and they lay the foundation for what becomes the liberationist church in Colombia. That's that connection. There's it's hard. It was the moment created it, rather than that simple history of liberation theology that we often resort to.
I'll take advantage of my position just to follow up on a point that you and Mike Baxter began to explore. One of the things about your book that I think is so important is that it tells simultaneously the stories of El Norte and South America, how they become mutually constitutive, how interacting with one another changes both of them. And I think that that's a fertile kind of a framework, both in getting a more adequate picture of the past, but also looking forward. At the same time, we're going through something of a renaissance in rereading and trying to reappreciate some of De Las Casas' role in all
Right.
of this. I mean, one of the strengths of much of your book is that you situate his role in the debates in Spain over the morality of conquest
Right.
in very secular terms. I mean, they're fighting about what becomes the human rights tradition. Can you speak some more about those kind of things? I think that really, beyond the particulars of Catholic baseball in the last 40 years or so, those are really important kinds of things to bring to attention, because I think they...
So like what? So give me an example.
So you've got De Las Casas as this figure. How do you relate him? And then he's still being fought over. He's still, he's still implicating both secular and religious assumptions in some serious ways.
Yeah. All right, I'll try. Well, so the book looks at the Spanish conquest and it looks at the dissent that emerged within Catholicism, the centrality of Catholicism as the venue that presided over the conquest. And in some ways, the Spanish conquest was the first conquest that had the terms of its own negation written into itself, because Catholicism presumed to be universal, and then encountering, or whatever word you want to use, the New World, realizing it exists, revealed to Catholicism that it was provincial. It wasn't universal. That the ancients didn't know much about anything, and this is all De Las Casas' point. And De Las Casas was part of a larger critique. The Salamanca school, Francisco Vitoria, other Dominicans that really lay the foundation for political modernity. And that's the argument of the book. The history that we get about political modernity is that it's all a Northern European invention, that Protestant, that Hugo Grotius is the founder of international law, that, John Locke and Adams, all of these people were reading the Salamanca school. Theorists. They were, and they were doing it largely to find workarounds against the moral prohibitions that the Salamanca theorists placed on war and dominion and slavery. For workarounds against the emancipationist ethic that came out of the Salamanca school, and De Las and the echoes are many. They run through history. I can talk always. De Las Casas is cited, revolutionary priests during the wars of revolution that sided with the revolution. Cited De Las Casas. Bolivar wanted to build a city named De Las Casas in between Venezuela and Colombia. And so his name is kind of carried forth, but also the critique that Las Casas and Vitoria and these other people who question the legality of the Spanish conquest takes on a new shape in two ways. One, it motivates Spanish American independence leaders, but then once independence is won, and they're contending with not the Spanish Empire, but the U.S. Empire, as the U.S. Empire moves west and takes Mexico and Texas and the Floridas. Spanish Americans revise that critique and apply it to the United States. And in many ways, what you see, I don't know if this is what you're trying to get me at, but if you raise the point of the book, and this is really the book, Latin America comes into the world, Spanish America in the 1820s, already a kind of League of Nations. 7 republics and Brazil's weird little empire, monarchy, but they have to learn how to live with each other, right? They're not, they have no imperial hinterlands. They have no colonies. So they begin to work out basically all of the ideas that you find at the founding of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco or at Versailles in 1919 were already debated and worked out by Spanish Americans in the 1820s and 1830s. The national border should be sacrosanct, that aggressive war should be illegal, and most importantly, that the international order should be founded on the presumption of cooperation and mutual interest rather than competitive balance of power. Now, on the other hand, you have the United States, which comes into the world a few decades earlier, comes into the world imagining itself the only nation on an empty continent. Obviously, it's not an empty continent. It was filled with peoples, and it was filled with polities and sovereignties. But the United States bases its notion of sovereignty on a revival of the doctrine of conquest. And that's what it uses as it moves west, to displace Native Americans. The Supreme Court rules numerous times that doctrine of conquest was what the United Nations was founded on. Doctrine of conquest is invoked in the conquest of Mexico and the taking of California. And so what you have in the 19th century is a long struggle of Latin American jurists trying to convince the United States to admit that the doctrine, to abrogate the doctrine of conquest, which the United States doesn't actually do until 1933, when finally Latin America forces it on them. So the resonance of De las Casas and that early critique that's engendered by watching what demographers call the greatest mortality event in human history, right? The Spanish conquest. Something within a century, 90% of the population had disappeared. But out of that carnage comes a kind of new morality, a modern morality of human equality, of solidarity, of notion of sovereignty, and it's basically just like Leo was formed by Latin America. So was much of the modern world, and that's one of the reasons why he's a great defender of it.
Any other questions? Please.
How do you see the latest fight between the Pope or Donald Trump against Pope Leo XIV in this ideologic map that you has built? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think it's just an upscaling ¿cómo se llama en español?
Creciente, sí, yeah.
Sí. Of the schismatic fight over the terms of the modern world between traditionalists and liberals and progressives in some ways. There's ways in which the religious the divisions within the Catholic Church map onto the larger culture wars that much of the world is now kind of embroiled in. So I think when Steve Bannon recognized Leo as the worst possible choice for MAGA, as he put it, he was right. I think he was right. Thinking, he knows what the stakes is, and that it's been a project of the right, including the broader right that has brought Trump to power, to retake the Catholic Church. People here could speak better to how serious that threat is, but you know, in the United States, it certainly seems that the Catholic Church is you know, moved very quickly from being, you know, a key constituency within a kind of broader New Deal social justice coalition into a majority of Catholics voting for Trump. And I think that, you know, Leo's papacy could be a deciding factor in whether that continues in that direction or whether there's an alternative. I mean, I think there's a lot at stake. I think really, and I don't know. It doesn't seem like there's any. I mean, I work a lot on Latin America. You know, I work mostly on Latin America, and as you know, I mean, what the Trump administration is doing in Latin America is unprecedented. I mean, in Ecuador, and you know, and what they're doing in Mexico. I mean, and there's no check on it. There's nothing that can stop it. And so, I guess you look for hope where you could find it, and an organization of 1 billion people led by somebody who was fought in Peru and was friends with Gustavo Gutierrez, and who uses Holy Thursday sermon to talk about imperialism and revealing the law as a lie is an inspiration and a breath of fresh air. I mean, I guess we have Spain's prime minister. I mean, he's doing pretty good, but there aren't a lot of moral inspirations, you know, in the world, and that's what was such a wonder that when you think about all of the steps that happened to get to a Leo papacy, it's quite amazing, and as you know, when the role that, you know, how he played, you know, what he did as bishop, and which you'll talk about tomorrow in Peru, the methodical, quiet, cautious but persistent way in which he worked to disassemble the Society of Christian Life is pretty inspirational, and let's hope that it continues.
Thank you.
If it's quick, we have time for one more question, and then we can commence from here.
Hi, Greg. Towards the end there, I don't know if you were here in the earlier session, but you touched on my soapbox topic about kind of dealing with the way the right has kind of co-opted the Catholic Church and how you push back against that in support of Leo and in support of, you know, the modern world. I just want to, I guess the main thing, the question is, like, where do you get institutional, do you have any thoughts on where we might get institutional support for that? Because there's been an institutional takeover, and there's all kinds of financial challenges for institutions to support, you know, presenting an authentic Catholic social vision. So anyway, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it sounds like you've been thinking about one of my favorite topics. So I thought I'd try to ask you, because I'm always looking for where do you find an institution where you can get some, it helps to have an institution to have some credibility. And so anyway.
But isn't the world's biggest institution the Vatican, the Catholic Church?
Well,
apart from the Catholic Church.
It is, but like, if you think of what it takes to promote a social vision, right? So
Yeah.
like the right-wing donor networks and think tanks
Yeah.
have been promoting a neoliberal, you know, whatever that social vision is. They've been working on it since the 1920s,
Yeah.
you know, with a lot more vigor since the 1980s. And so to build, so like the Vatican doesn't have an institution focused on promoting a Catholic social vision against the social vision promoted by the right in the United States.
But I mean, just your very first question, I mean, how can we support Leo? I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, conferences like this, talking about it, acknowledging it, recognizing the struggle for what it is.
No, I just threw that out there because like I know people I've talked to from like decades ago, people were trying to like fund a Catholic think tank, to find
yeah.
backing for a Catholic think tank to try to vindicate a Catholic social vision.
Right.
And they gave up. Like people were working on it in the 80s, 90s, trying to figure out, because Catholics who like Catholic social teaching will fund like soup kitchens and stuff like that. Whereas Catholics who basically, want to support, a oligarchy, they'll happily fund, something that'll get you to an oligarchy.
Yeah.
And anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there because it sounds
Maybe
like
we
you've been
could
thinking.
speak to Mackenzie Bezos.
That would be nice. If you have a phone number, let me know. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know anything about this stuff. Yeah. I mean,
We'll
but
make
all
some
those
phone calls.
foundations are so
We'll
invested
make some
in middle
phone
of the
calls.
road.
That's a good idea.
They're so invested in. They're either like middle of the third way horrible stuff, or just middle of the road. But you're right. There certainly isn't the kind of right wing infrastructure that's ideological, that understands itself in a world historical struggle, that understands what it means to capture an institution, what it means to put out a vision of what they think is a moral society, right? We get stuck with I don't know, tax credits for something. It's not a. There is.
You'll have to come back and figure that one out.
Yeah, to come back
Yeah.
and figure it out.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking our invitation.